All right. Is she recording? I think she is. Okay. Usually she says like recording in progress, but I guess this time she's
I
not going.
heard it.
It's just my laptop then. All right, cool. So I am here with Jennifer Miller. She's the author of Rising Class, which is a nominee for the Catalyst Award for Best Nonfiction. Jen, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I was just telling you before we started recording that like I love this book and I just love laughing at some of the really relatable stories in this book. And so just tell us a little bit, I guess, about yourself, about what your background is, and how you came to write this book and put it together in this way.
Sure. So I'm Jen. I have been a journalist for the last 20 plus years, uh, freelance mainly, writing for the New York Times and the Washington Post. I also write books. And this book is actually really unique in terms of the work that I've done in the past because it is the first book that I have written that is young adult. So it is focuses on young people and it is for a young audience. So it's really for teenagers and for
Mhm.
students who are early in their college career. YA nonfiction is kind of a genre that is not really that well known, especially in terms of real-time reporting. And what makes it so special is that it really tells the stories of young adults through their eyes, through their perspective, up close.
Mhm.
And they're the ones that are kind of commenting on the adults around them, on the systems around them. They're not having that stuff imposed on them. And so it was a really special experience to be able to follow the extraordinary young people in Rising Class. Yeah, I've covered education a lot. This book grew out of a story that I had written about a young man who was the first in his family to go to college, and he really wanted to go to a PWI, predominantly
Mhm.
white institution. He's Black, the child
Mhm.
of immigrants. And it was really about why that was his ambition and what he hoped to get out of being in that kind of environment, and really making space for himself and what that was going to be like. And I think in reporting that story, he encountered a lot of challenges that he wasn't expecting. I mean, he knew it was going to be tough.
Mhm.
Um, and so, you know, we can talk more about kind of like how the book explicitly came to be, but I ended up wanting to see what this experience, a year in the life of
Mhm.
first generation and low income students would be like. I started out looking at a PWI at Columbia University, and then it turned out that I was able to expand to actually look at community college as well,
Mhm.
because there's a romantic relationship that spans Missouri to New York City
Mhm.
and back, and all kinds of interesting drama around that as well. So,
Yes, well, it was so interesting for me to read because I actually I went to Teachers College, which is like affiliated with Columbia or whatever for grad school. So anytime I get to read something where I'm like, it's not the same experience, it's undergrad versus grad school, but I was like 22 when I started. So like basically the same age group as these kids you're writing about. And I found so many relatable things and it was so cool to read it and actually be able to like picture specific places and thinking like, yeah, I know what you're talking about when you're talking about that place or that thing. Um, so you originally started with Columbia because you wanted to look at a PWI, is that right?
yeah, in part. I mean, also at the time, I live in Brooklyn, and I had just had my second child. And so I was very much limited by geography. And I looked into a number of schools. I mean, I wasn't sure at the beginning whether it was only going to be I mean, I knew I wanted to include a PWI, but I didn't know if that was going to be the only school. And I reached out to a lot of college access programs and a lot of first gen offices at the colleges and ended up interviewing a lot of students. And was just able to identify a couple of kids who I think they really wanted to participate in this project. They really wanted to have their voices out there. And also, I wanted a diversity of experience because the first gen experience is obviously incredibly diverse. And
Mhm.
so just the students that I ended up narrowing in on. So one is Briani, who is from the South. She is the daughter of her dad is Mexican. He actually came here undocumented. He's now a citizen, and her mom came from the Dominican Republic. And she was really eager to get out of the South and come to New York. And
Mhm.
her story is very interesting because what she found when she got here is not exactly what she hoped or wanted. I mean, she had a wonderful experience, but it was
Mhm.
complicated in ways she didn't expect. And then
Mhm.
there's Connor, who is white, who is from a rural community in Missouri, who
Mhm.
also, for his own reasons, was very eager to get out of Missouri. And also did not find Columbia to be what he had anticipated. And then Connor's girlfriend, Jacqueline, who stayed in Missouri and went to community college and then ended up being a transfer student and
Mhm.
transferring to a 4-year institution.
Mhm.
And so, really diverse perspectives, worldviews, backgrounds. The final thing I'll say is that, unbeknownst to me, because I started following these kids in 2019, the
Mhm.
pandemic hit
Yeah.
halfway through the year and then turned everything upside down. So there were a lot of experiences, obviously none of which any of us anticipated, but really I think allowed the book to really zoom in on some of these class
Mhm.
discrepancies that became just so apparent during the
Mhm.
pandemic that wouldn't have come through as strongly in an ordinary year.
Yeah, I mean, you actually, I think the first chapter, the prologue, is about Briani like packing up and leaving campus because of the pandemic. And she actually, I think she makes a, I don't know if it's in that chapter or in a later one, but she makes a comment about maybe there'll be less to forgive in New York. And I found it so interesting that you have these students that are from, red states, conservative areas, and they're like, things will be better up there in New York. And as soon as I read a couple of those lines, I was like, poor babies, like, no, it won't. But it's just kind of like this push and pull of home that they experience. And I know I always go back to like what Bell Hooks wrote about that push and pull from home. I think it's just one of those things that any first gen story, there's some element of that. There's this element of wanting to go and see something new and different and sometimes maybe escape certain things, especially because you're also a child when you're making these decisions about college. And so there's this sense of like, it's my turn to go out on my own and build something for myself. And then you get there and you're sometimes smacked in the face with a lot of realities, some great, some that make you want to go home, some that make you want to stay. And I think there's that like constant tension that she experienced. And I think the example that I thought was so funny when she's like, maybe there'll be less to forgive. And then the first chapter of the book is like this kid stealing her bin that she's trying to move out of her dorm with. I'm like obsessed with this story, this little chapter, this prologue, because I knew as soon as I saw the title, I'm like, someone stole her bin. I just know it. Like I just know where this is going because people do it and people will say, "Oh, is that yours?" That thing that like is checked out to a specific person and everyone's responsible for an individual level and costs $350 to replace. Oh, is that yours? Oh, I didn't realize. And she talks about like, of course he realized, but he didn't care. And why is that? So my next question for you is like, why did you want to start with that story?
To me, that's yeah, it's a great question. And it's a great moment, which, I think Briani, like there's humor in it and also it's very sad. I mean,
Yeah.
so to give viewers context, so Briani's moving out. Um, Students are able to rent these like just enormous moving bins on wheels to pack up all their stuff. And at the time, the university had given kids, you got to be out in like 48 hours.
Yeah.
So it was extremely stressful. And you sign the bin out, but if you don't return it within the allotted time, you have to pay a hefty fee. And if you lose it, you have to pay many hundreds of dollars, which of course a lot of students don't have. Briani certainly, didn't have it.
Mhm.
And she had to leave her bin because she was on a floor that didn't have an elevator. So every time she would have to bring her stuff one floor down, and then she'd have to like carry everything. And then one of these trips, the bin was gone. Um, and so the reason I started with that story is that I think it really encapsulates the unseen challenges that a lot of first gen students face. And it really encapsulates the class discrepancy between a student like Briani and so many of her peers at Columbia. I think if you are, and there's, not making a judgment, but if you are a kid who always has enough money in your bank account, whose parents are probably replenishing your account, perhaps without you even asking them to. And you know that you have that safety net, so that if you did lose your bin or somebody took your bin, your parents might be missed, but they have the money to pay for it. And maybe you don't even worry so much about asking them. For Briani, all of these things, which I think a lot of kids take for granted, she cannot take for granted because her parents they didn't have the money if she couldn't repay it. And she grew up in an environment in which she would not at all feel comfortable asking them. Even if they did have the money, she would not feel comfortable asking them because there's a notion of how much her family sacrificed for her to get to where she is. And, I should say her parents are incredibly loving and incredibly supportive, and often would try to, would say, I've got some extra money this month. I want to put it in your account, right? And but there was a guilt that she would feel associated with that. And I think that these are just, the peculiarities of that psychology are things that so many students just don't understand. And so, yes, it's just typical rudeness, obviously, but then there are all these other layers. Um,
I love that you bring up the parents' point of view. And it just made me think of a conversation I had a few months ago with a student, another first gen student, an out of state student. And for context, I work at University of Southern California, which also has quite a lot of privilege, but also, a first gen plus center and plenty of first gen students too. And I was talking to this student about how she was like, I am like $20 short on my rent and I don't know what to do. And I could ask my mom, but like I would never want to put her in that position. And we had these conversations like kind of back and forth about what she should do. And there was this sense that like her mom can spare $20. Um, but she just didn't want to ask for it, right? She had that guilt of like, I'm supposed to be I'm supposed to have the family on my shoulders now because I'm like this hope for the future and I'm the one they've sacrificed everything for. And I kind of told her eventually, like, I don't know your mom, I don't know your family, so you have to decide this. But sometimes, like, your parents want to make those sacrifices for you too. And that's sometimes the best gift you can give them is letting them do that and letting them still feel like your parent. Um, but like you said, the psychology behind that is like, it's crazy. There's so many layers to it. And I think just that one simple example, I mean, I could write a whole dissertation just about that one example and like everything that's going on there. So I just love that it started out like that. And then you also had another example of this student responsibility fee that Briani was going to have to pay. And I have never heard of this before. I was on Reddit all morning trying to figure out what this fee was and how they calculate it, and I still don't know. Um, so I'm like, okay, if I'm almost 40 and I don't know, then I'm sure this 18-year-old was lost. But can you tell us a little more about that fee and like just what is it and why did she have to pay it and how did it impact her?
Yeah, well, so I think a lot of schools have these fees where even if you're on a scholarship, or the school is covering your tuition, there's still an outstanding. The idea is that your parents don't have to pay anything out of pocket, but that doesn't mean that you don't still, as the student, don't still owe the school
Yeah.
money. And the way that they have balanced their books. Is that they're expecting students to pay a certain amount of money every year. There's part of it is maybe during the year, part of it is from the summer. And this,
Mhm.
I think that this may be changing a little bit with,
Mhm.
like, I know that students at Columbia have really been fighting to get rid of this fee, and it's possible that they've succeeded. I
Mhm.
don't, it's been now a while since I was reporting this, and
Mhm.
so I don't actually know whether it still exists. But the idea is that Briani still had this outstanding money that she had to pay. Some of that would be taken care of through her federal work study,
Mhm.
but not all of it. And especially if she wanted a job on campus that didn't, some jobs maybe cover more than others. And she
Mhm.
really wanted to be a student journalist. She really wanted to work on the newspaper. But that job, even though it pays, doesn't pay enough, for example, to
Mhm.
cover the fee. And so if she wants to pursue that extracurricular activity, that thing that she really wants to do and she's really
Mhm.
passionate about, and might, be the thing that she needs to pave the foundation for her
Mhm.
career,
Mhm.
there are barriers. Even
Mhm.
though theoretically she's supposed to come in on equal footing, there are still barriers that, either make it hard for her, either make it impossible for her to do it, or just make it harder and that much more stressful.
Mhm.
Similar thing with the pandemic, where the question was, are they going to waive the summer fee? Because a lot of students,
Mhm.
they make that money in their summer jobs, but nobody was allowed to work. They weren't allowed to, and so, Columbia did end up waiving that fee, but there was a period of time in which nobody knew, and that was really anxiety producing. And then the final thing I'll
Mhm.
say is, like, in terms of career preparation, right, which like starts a lot during college, when you
Mhm.
have, there's so, and as like, a lot of internships, a lot of opportunities are unpaid, and these are the things that often help you build that social capital and help you make those connections. So, like, not only, does Briani and her friends in that cohort, like, not have the money to move to New York or Washington, D.C. and like take those unpaid internships, but they actually have to be making money in
Mhm.
order to pay off that summer responsibility, which then relegates them to going back to, working at Old Navy, where she had worked through high school,
Mhm.
and other things.
Mhm.
And so it's just, there are all these kind of like unseen costs,
Mhm.
all of these hidden fees
Yeah.
that, I think a lot of students, I mean, everyone has to pay the fee, right? But a lot of people's parents are just able to take care of it.
Mhm. Yeah, I think even the example of like oh my gosh, I can't remember the brand, but it was like the down jackets that everyone had and Brianni's from
Canada Goose.
Georgia. The goose. I was laughing because I also worked at Old Navy when I was in undergrad. I'm like, I relate to these students so much, but I had my Old Navy. I mean, I'm from Connecticut, so I'm used to cold weather, but I have my little Old Navy puffer jacket, and it's not like the warmest jacket. And I remember the same thing, like going to school in New York, and you're walking around a lot more outside than you are like somewhere that's a little more car centric. And people always being like, why don't you just get a better coat? And I was like, this is the coat. Like this coat has to last me for a while. And so I just thought that like just sometimes there's this one example where you're like someone saying, why don't you just? And I'm sure they heard that a lot. Why don't you just ask your parents for money? Why don't you just, ask a friend to check you out another bin? Like I'm sure she felt guilty about even doing that. Like, why don't you just get a better jacket? And so I think like one of the things I loved in here is just exposing, I think, a lot of these little moments that that add up to this feeling like this kind of isn't my home. It kind of is. Like maybe in some little pockets it is. And I know I think in the prologue there, you talked about a sign that says like, make it your home. And I was like highlighting that 5 million times because I'm like, what does that even mean for a first gen student? Um, and then Fanny talks about how she did make it her home, kind of, and she has this
She
bin incident.
Yeah, I mean, she did. Like, she did, by the end, she did consider Columbia her home, and she felt that she made space for herself, and
Yeah.
she found a place for herself. She found the people that understood her. And there's a lot to recommend that the experience that she had, certainly over a lot of what she experienced back in Georgia.
Mhm.
I mean, she had teachers who really listened to her and respected her,
Mhm.
teachers who, acknowledged the marginalization that she had, experienced in other contexts.
Mhm.
She found a lot of friends across class lines,
Mhm.
that she became close to.
Mhm.
So, but I think that the struggles are unique, and again, they're
Mhm.
often unseen. And
Mhm.
so, in part, that's why, that's what I'm hoping to do with this book, is
Yes.
to, both show other first gen students that, this is what it might look like for you.
Mhm.
I think whether you're at a Columbia or a state school or a community college, like these are some of the things you might experience. These are some of the challenges, some of this, and the way that you can overcome those challenges and
Mhm.
persevere. And then also, I'm really hoping that students who are not first gen will read this book, because I think that, I mean, I'm not a first gen student, and I, as a reporter and really immersing myself in this world, it just made me think of how valuable a book like this would have been for me, to be able to be a more
Yeah.
empathetic friend and roommate and
Mhm.
whatever it may be, to just like be aware of things that it just never crossed my mind to be aware of.
I love that. I think this book needs to be on like these common book, common experience lists because I think it would be so good. Even for like a freshman in college that's already there, that maybe is stealing someone's bin, like saying just get a better coat or whatever, like to kind of, just at least have a little bit of like critical thought about the things they're saying that they aren't thinking about because at the end of the day, you just became an adult when you get to college. And I know in my job, we still call them the kids, and people are always
Yeah.
like, "They're not kids," and I'm like, "Yeah, they're not, but they are." Like, come on, they're still kids.
Yeah.
They're in that, like, little in-between phase, and they're still figuring it out, so if y'all are watching and you're in charge of the common book at your university or college, just check this one out, Rising Class.
Thank you.
Um, Wanna switch gears a little bit and talk about Connor and Jacqueline. I love that there's, like, this little love story within this, and just, like, we get to meet them at the point when they're about to go their separate ways. Why did you decide to bring Jacqueline and her community college experience into the fold and portray that relationship?
Well, the majority of first gen students are not at Columbia's. They are at community college, and or at larger state schools, not Ivy League schools. So I thought that there was real value in trying to understand, what why somebody would choose to stay close to home, first of all,
Mhm,
and to have a collegiate experience that's considered less traditional, and then
mhm,
also how they were going to navigate that, because it's not just a question of a long distance relationship between two teenagers, which obviously, I mean, we know what's going to happen, right? It never those relationships rarely, sometimes they do, but rarely work out. But
mhm,
then on top of it, they have all of those first gen pressures, which in the case of Connor and Jacqueline, um, a lot of responsibilities at home, responsibilities like financial responsibilities, emotional and psychological responsibilities. Both of them came from very different, difficult family lives,
mhm,
addiction in their households, and going to college and striking out on your own when you are leaving behind people who rely on you, people who, turn to you for a lot of support, when you are in some ways the
mhm,
parent in some contexts,
mhm,
and where college is just not the thing that is expected.
mhm,
That, and how Jacqueline and Connor would either navigate that together, or how that would pose challenges for them in their relationship. I was just eager to see how that was going to pan out. And also, they just both have really like great personalities. Jacqueline in particular is just hilarious and has a very distinct point of view. And so as soon as I met her, I knew that she was going to be a star of this story, because
yeah,
she tells it like it is. And like, you want your readers to
yeah.
have somebody like that as a role model.
Yeah, I love that. I know that you mentioned kind of early on in the book that they both, were impacted by addiction in their families. We also have another nominee for Best Memoir, Monica Potts, who wrote The Forgotten Girls, which is similar in a way, although it's her kind of like revisiting her hometown, um, and kind of seeing like how her and a childhood friend's lives just went like in total opposite directions because of addiction. And I feel like sometimes when we think about first gen students, at least in California, but I think a lot there's a conflation of like race and first gen status, and people will assume that it's students of color. And many, if not most, of the first gens in the US are actually like poor, white, rural, or kind of semi rural type of students who come from these areas where there is a lot of addiction, a lot of unemployment, and so on. And I thought it was just cool to see these two students from that type of area, which I also have family in actually. I had so many like connections to this book. It was weird. My family's from Springfield, Missouri. So
Oh, wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
so I've been there and like I know the area. And to watch them take these two different paths and kind of lean on each other, even though, or try to lean on each other, even though what they were experiencing was so different in so many ways. I loved, I think like one of my favorite points in this book is when Connor gets an email from his initial roommate that he's assigned to, spells his name wrong, and is like, hey bro, do me a solid. Like I'm on the lacrosse team. I forget what kind of sport it was, but I'm on some team and like I need to be with this other guy. And I love how Jacqueline's like, he's basically asking you to write an email for him, uh, you know, reminding them that this other guy is entitled to something. And I was like, okay, Jacqueline like keeps it real. She doesn't hold back. But I was gonna ask you like why did you include that little snippet of Connor's experience in there?
I mean, I think in part, for just to talk like specifically to Connor, I really wanted to bring out his his the aspects of his personality that that moment highlights is really like his generosity and his sensitivity. Um, Unlike Jacqueline, who is not sensitive, like in that way, right? I mean, Connor
Yeah.
was really trying to be nice to this kid who is essentially saying, like, I don't want to room with you. I need to room with somebody else. You need to fix the problem,
Mhm.
Connor. And Jacqueline said, this guy is taking advantage of you. And Connor's like, well, no, maybe he has like better intentions, right? So I mean, a moment like that, I think, on the one hand, like really brings out Connor's personality, really shows the relationship dynamic between him and Jacqueline, and shows us who Jacqueline is. And
Mhm.
I think in Connor's own way, um, essentially does the same thing that the bin does for Briani, which is to
Yeah.
just kind of show this sense of entitlement, and privilege that I think, some students at these schools have.
Mhm.
And just like kind of the not being able to have the kind of perspective to think about how your actions and your words are impacting the
Mhm.
people around you. But also I think, just Connor's kind of optimism, just his pervasive optimism to try to see the best in everyone and to try to make the best of every situation, even situations that are really crappy, which
Mhm.
has, that's kind of been a lot of events in his life, is like trying to
Mhm.
make the best of some really hard situations. And so that moment, I think, kind of encapsulated both like the kind of character development, if you will, as well as like these larger kind of
Yeah.
like kind of cultural barriers and assumptions that he's going to be running into.
Yeah, I love that story. I think especially when he writes back to this person that's supposed to be his roommate and is like, hey, are you getting excited to start? And he just gets no response. And I'm like, yeah, he's done with you. Like you've played your role for him. Like you're kind of just an instrument that he used to get this thing he wanted, and that's that. And that, I think that example for me made me really think about the first gen identity, which I think is, at its heart is like this familial identity, right? And then
Mhm.
also this institutional identity. But it bleeds into your social identity as well. And I thought that was such a good example of that, of like, had the tables been turned, maybe the other kid wouldn't care that he didn't get an email response or like that someone didn't want to room with him or whatever. Um, but you could just kind of tell Connor's like, I am trying to be a nice guy here, and like, what am I getting for it? But he still gets his cheesecake at I think it's the end of the same chapter. So I was like, I love that he's like, I know this cheesecake isn't going to be good, but I'm just going to make it good because I'm going to enjoy it. And that's kind of his whole attitude towards the whole experience, I think, which I loved. I love him. I need to send him a cheesecake. Like,
Ah,
you need
ah,
to, yeah, you need to like,
you would love
give me his
that.
address. I will send him a whole New York cheesecake, a good one, because he deserves it. And he also talked about like maybe New York will give me this fresh start. Um, and Jacqueline didn't really like get that type of experience. So what was kind of the difference and how did it impact our relationship to like have such different college experiences?
Yeah. I mean, it was so interesting because I really had this idea. I had this going into it, I assumed, I had an assumption that Connor would was essentially leaving Jacqueline behind, would go to the big city, would have this transformative experience, and she wouldn't be able to keep up, and he would, kind of ultimately move on from her. And like, in fact, it was really the opposite, which was so
Mhm,
surprising and
mhm,
for her, wonderful in certain ways, where he really struggled with the displacement, I think. And in part it was because, Columbia, he poor kid, he ended up in the party dorm, and he is not a party kid. He's like, because of his background with familial addiction, because of just he is like an intellectual's intellectual, and did
mhm,
not the party dorm was not the right place for him. And so he had a really hard time
mhm,
that first year finding his place socially.
mhm,
Um, and so Jacqueline actually, I think, having the stability of being able to
mhm,
come home at the end of the day,
mhm,
and really kind of, in a way, being on this like mature, equal footing with her mom, because now she's kind of an adult, and she's living with her mom, but it's not like a teen parent situation as much
mhm.
anymore. It's like two adults kind of
Yeah.
cohabitating. Um, and so Jacqueline really came into her own and really became, was able to make new friends, was able to, find the things that she was passionate about, and
Mhm,
would spend all this time online with Connor and just be able to kind of peer into his world over Zoom and or FaceTime. And it was kind of sad, like, seeing the way in which he was struggling and like not really being able to help him. And
mhm,
and it's not to say that leaving was the wrong choice for Connor. I think Connor, ultimately it was the right choice. It took him more time to find his place, to find his
mhm,
people.
mhm,
But I also, it was really educational for me to see that staying where you are is sometimes actually the right choice. I mean, Jacqueline,
mhm,
after 2 years, she transferred to a 4-year college. When she graduated, she was the only one of the people I was following who actually had a job lined up. And she went to
mhm,
work in graphic design, which was the field that she loved. And like, this was the right path for her. And I think that probably it's the right path for a lot of people. And that's something that
mhm.
really, maybe gets overlooked when we're thinking about how you do college.
Yeah, I was just talking to another nominee, Irina Smith, who's also a nominee for Best Memoir, and she's a college counselor. And she lives in Palo Alto, so she works with a lot of families that live in Palo Alto specifically because that's like the pipeline to Stanford and all these great schools. And a lot of times she talks to the parents about how um, when you are the valedictorian of your high school, like you might be special, but when you go somewhere where everyone's the valedictorian, like that becomes meaningless. And sometimes that's not the best thing for every student to be scrapping and fighting and struggling just because a college has like a certain ranking or a certain reputation. And she talked a lot about that, people don't really think about the fit um, not just financially, but just like what's gonna be a good transition for this student? Because I think the challenge, support, kind of balance when you go to an Ivy League school, it's just not really there in my experience. they're just kind of expecting you to like to know everything, to do everything. And if you don't, it's really seen as a sign of like weakness or a shortcoming or a sign of immaturity on your part. Whereas my undergrad, I went to a state school. Um, I commuted to school. I went to school with a lot of people who were grown adults with kids who were working and going to school with me at night. And the transition, I was like, "Ooh," and looking back, like, I wouldn't go to Columbia again for grad school. I would go to my state school in a heartbeat. It would have prepared me better. I would have, like, given me the confidence going into, being a teacher. I think it's something that's so missed sometimes is, like, you're already a first gen, sometimes that stability is gonna help you in the long run, but you're a kid, you're 18, you're a dreamer, you're like into Columbia or Stanford or whatever. Like you're not gonna not go. Um, but I think a lot of us, look back in hindsight and are like, maybe it wasn't the best place, or maybe I just didn't know what I was getting myself into, even if it did turn out to be a good decision. And I think just kind of showing like these three different stories, it really shows I don't know that like Columbia is not this one size fits all place for everyone. And, you know, you can be better going to your community college in Springfield, Missouri, and just building on like what you've already established. So I love that you kind of highlighted that. And I have so many thoughts about this book because I just love it. I do know that you have things to go to and get to in 2 minutes. So I'm just gonna ask like any final thoughts, anything else that you want to share with whoever's watching about the book, the subjects, the publishing process, and even what's next for you.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say like my favorite thing about this book was how nobody's journey ended up the way that I expected it to. I mean, even putting COVID aside,
Mhm,
like I've already talked a little bit about how Connor and Jacqueline their stories diverged in a way that I wasn't really expecting.
mhm,
And even Briani, I mean, just the way in which she had this idea of what the and I'm not even talking about money and class, but like even like in terms of like kind of worldview, ideology,
mhm,
politics, like the type of people that she thought she would find,
mhm,
and how it was really hard for her to find her place coming from the South, as coming from a religious community,
mhm,
um, and for herself, like being a really religious person, but also coming from a household that was very politically conservative, and having views that might not be conservative, but for Columbia,
mhm,
maybe are considered a little conservative, and and um and so just having to, it's not, these are not black and white things.
mhm.
There's a lot of nuance in this book, and nuance that I learned as I was reporting it and really tried to reflect, just how many shades of gray there are. And that was really the most wonderful, most special thing for me. And that's what I hope that readers will take away from it when, in terms of like what these experiences are like.
I mean, I think you have achieved that. Like, I love these short little chapters, and there's always these things you pick out where you're like, there are 5 million layers to this one little comment that I could think about all day. So the book is brilliant. Um, Jen, if people want to like learn more about what you're doing or follow you on social media, how can they do that?
Yeah. So definitely check out my website, which is byjennifermiller.com, byjennifermiller.com. I mean, I am barely on social media, but
That's
you can
cool.
find me at PropGen on Twitter and Instagram, but I'm really not there. And yes, my next book that I'm working on, which I hope people will keep an eye out for, is going to be covering teen mental health. So it's also young adult for young adult readers. And I'm following three high school students.
Mm,
It's a year in the life of what it's like to have various mental health challenges and navigate your sophomore and junior year of high school.
amazing. We are looking forward to that. Any first gens in that story?
Yes, although I'm not sure that they're all well, one of them, I'm not sure she's going to college.
Mhm.
We'll see.
That's part of the first gen, I think, experience is like figuring out if you're going to go to college too, especially nowadays where like college is pushed on everyone, I think. So we are looking forward to that. Jen, thank you so much for your time. Again, y'all, the book is Rising Class. It is Chef's Kiss. It's so good. It's like a pretty easy read too. It's not the kind of thing where you're gonna have to like at the end of a long day, you're like, oh, I'm not like mentally ready to read this. You can pick it up and just immediately be immersed in the lives of these students. So go check it out, and we're gonna announce the winners for the Catalyst Awards in about 2 weeks. So Jen, we'll let you know how the voters vote, the judges judge, but um, yeah, all y'all look out for that on our social media in a couple weeks. And Jen, again, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much. This was awesome.
All right.